Jean, Darlene, Jacqueline, written and recorded by Marie Crook. Jean decided to wear Darlene for her stroll around the park. Peering into the rusted brass mirror over the sink, she first applied cold cream to her face in vigorous swoops before removing it with a torn-off strip of cotton wool. She penciled in 2 dark eyebrows where her own used to be, then slipped Darlene out from beneath a musty towel hanging on the back of the door and eased it smoothly over her scalp. Darlene was a glossy French bob which kicked out pleasingly around the jaw and had a thick fringe. It was quite unlike the fine fair hair Jean once had naturally, which was precisely why she liked it. If the drugs she took to remove her pain and her rage were also going to steal her hair, at least she could empower herself with a touch of Paris in the form of brunette-hued acrylic. And if the drugs were going to muffle, under a thick carpet of frost, any other emotion she might be tempted to feel, Jean could at least achieve the semblance of a changing mood by changing her look. Loud snores rattled the door of her brother Michael's room as Jean squeezed her way past the bulging black sacks lining the landing and made her way to the room she could never get used to thinking of as her own. Her mother would be proud that she kept it just as it was when she was here. The sheets even, still unchanged. The dentures still grinning at her from their glass on the bedside table, as though they'd only just been removed for the last time. Soon Michael would wake and start banging his stick against the wall, the signal that Jean was to bring his breakfast without delay. Soon he would stomp downstairs in his ancient dressing gown to settle himself in front of the small TV, with his cigarettes, his cans, and the whiskey he would progress to when all the cans were empty. Their parents would be watching, as always, indulgently over him from their dusty urns on the mantelpiece. Jean regretted spending the best half of her adult life pursuing, to the exclusion of all else, a budding career as a PA. She didn't regret, not really, giving it all up to care for her ailing parents. But she had come to regret the promise she'd made on her mother's deathbed. To take care of Michael, estranged from his wife and moving back into the house they now owned equally and could not bear or afford to sell. Jean now spent her days shielding the house and herself from his pain and rage. But there was the park. And there were some days when Jean made it out of the door to take a stroll there before Michael woke. What she felt was not happiness exactly as she entered by the Davenhill Road gate. She had, rather, a feeling she could describe as pleasant, and that would do, especially on days like this one, when the paths were glistening with frost and the grass sparkled. The people she met in the park were not friends exactly, but they sometimes nodded and said good morning, and that would be enough to make it feel like a good day. Entering the park today, Jean expected to be met with the usual sounds. Birdsong, the distant calls of children on the playground, and the trains rushing past on the high bank nearby. Instead, she was greeted by the rumbling and growling of a small digger, making its way around the top of the grassy mound which had stood for years to no apparent purpose. A handful of men in high vis called brusquely to one another across the mound as the digger gouged out a series of small ditches. Blocking her path to the left was a lorry bearing a load of sand and several large stones, and Jean wondered what they were building. She hoped it would be a new bandstand to replace the one that once graced this park and was torn down before she was old enough to remember it had ever been there at all. She recalled the water-damaged old photo back at the house that showed her parents standing proudly before it in their Sunday best, surrounded by a sea of sepia snowdrops, tulips and daffodils. It would be nice to see at least something from that time restored. Jean was startled back to the present by the distant sound of someone calling her name. "Ian! Ian!" she heard over the rumble and grind of the digger. She looked at the workmen, absorbed in their task, as oblivious to her as if she'd simply been a tree standing there. She looked beyond, towards the playground, and saw no one. When she looked past the lorry towards Woodland Road, she saw a young man hurrying in her direction, waving and calling, she could now hear, Jacqueline! Jacqueline! Strange name for a dog, thought Jean. And why would anyone let their dog off the lead around all these diggers? She turned to walk briskly the other way, fearing a scene, taking care not to slip on the ice, as the man began to call more loudly and frantically, out of breath as though he'd broken into a jog. Jacqueline! Jean heard his footsteps quicken behind her and felt a sudden warm hand on her shoulder. She spun around to face him, shocked at his touch. He smiled and words tumbled out of him like coins from a winning slot machine. Jacqueline! It's so nice to see you. It's been years. You do remember me, don't you? Jake, you're Ollie's friend from Cringle High. I've just moved back to the area. Ollie must have told you. Anyway, I was going to call round for a cup of tea, but here you are. I'm so glad to run into you. Are you walking? Shall we walk together and catch up? He was a good foot taller than her, and, she guessed, mid-30s, with floppy hair, bright, eager eyes, and what looked like paint splatters on his trousers. Jean opened her mouth, intending to put him straight, but before she could speak, he threw out his arms and stooped to embrace her. To her great surprise, Jean allowed herself to soften into his bear hug. As she felt his warmth, she realised she didn't want to put him straight, because then he would just walk away, leaving her standing there all alone. She wondered, again to her surprise, how easy it might be to slip into Jacqueline, just as she slipped into Darlene that morning. Jake, she said, hoping her voice wouldn't give her away. How lovely to see you. Yes, let's walk. Delighted, Jake took Jean's arm to steady her against the ice. Fortunately, he was more of a talker than a listener, and when Jean said, "Tell me everything," he did. Well, as you know, after uni I moved to London, where I lived close to Ollie and where I met my wife, Katie. I'm sure Ollie's told you all about the wedding. He certainly did, said Jean. It sounded like an unforgettable occasion. Oh, we had a ball, said Jake, and the honeymoon. Paris really is terrific in springtime. Have you been? Not yet, smiled Jean. She wondered if Michael had woken yet, and if he was banging, calling for his breakfast. It's never too late, Jake laughed, turning to look at her. If he had any doubts, he didn't show them. He did say it had been a long time since they'd seen each other. He told her about his little girl, Nell, well into her terrible twos and causing all kinds of mayhem. Guessing that her wisest course of action would be to affect a vague kind of absent-mindedness, forgivable in one her age, Jean asked, "And are you still working at—" as though just momentarily forgetting the name of the company. Yep, still at Siemens. I've been promoted, and we did well out of the flat sale in London, so we've been able to buy a nice house up here. We're right on the other side of the park, but just in the Heatons rather than Lev. Yes, Ollie did tell me, said Jean, getting into her stride now. You've gone all posh. It's nice of you to still speak to us over this side. Oh no, Jake laughed. There's nothing wrong with Lev. I had some of the happiest times of my life round at your house. I'll never forget your cheese and onion pie, and that time 10 of us had a sleepover. You were so lovely, even when Oscar threw up on your rug after too much ice cream. Do you remember? How could I forget, smiled Jean. And then after a moment, those were some of my happiest times too. As they passed the high bank on which the railway line ran, a train raced past, London bound. Jean wondered how she must look to any passengers gazing down at the park from the train window, walking with her glossy hair beside this handsome young man, arm in arm on the frosty path. Hey, said Jake as they passed the Crossley Road gate. I only live up there. Do you want to come and meet Katie and little Nell? They could faintly hear the banging and shouting of the workmen over on the mound. That would be lovely, said Jean. Jake's new house had a driveway with a skip on it, filled with rubble and plasterboard. He apologised for the mess, telling her they were in the middle of renovations. A smell of paint and turpentine hit them as they stepped through Jake's front door, and the sight of gleaming white walls against stripped pine floorboards. Jake shoved a couple of unpacked boxes out the way so they could get through to the clean, bright, open-plan kitchen. As she took it all in, Jean thought of the kitchen waiting for her at home. The old chipped formica work surfaces, piled high with tins and tubs and old plastic containers, dirty dishcloths and tea towels, barely an inch to be found where one could chop an onion, let alone bake a pie or breathe. Years and years of accumulated stuff. She found herself picturing Jacqueline's kitchen, unfashionable now, she imagined, all magnolias and browns, but gleaming, wholesome, homey, the smell of dumplings and roly-poly filling the cosy air. The telephone in the hall ringing, bringing news of London and life, and when will I see you next? "Katie!" Jake called up the stairs. "You'll never guess who I found." Katie, pretty and tired, appeared from above, a sticky-faced baby girl on her hip. "It's Ollie's mum, Jacqueline," Jake said proudly, like he'd brought home the catch of the day for dinner. He helped Jean take off her coat and she smiled nervously in the soiled jumper she thought no one would see. She feared that Darlene would be gleaming foolishly now under the kitchen spotlights, and wondered if she saw or only imagined a flicker of hesitation in Jake's eyes as they travelled over her face properly for the first time. In the kitchen were several boxes of the units Jake and Katie had still to assemble. "We're doing most of the work ourselves," said Jake. As he put the kettle on, Nell began to cry, and while Jake and Katie spoke at length about their plans for the kitchen, the house, the garden, she didn't stop. They passed her between them, rocking, bouncing, distracting, but she became more and more agitated. "Would you mind?" asked Katie, passing the furious hot Nell over to Jean. "You're the one with the most experience, maybe you can soothe her." Jean froze, then held out her arms awkwardly as Nell was placed in her lap, where she instantly calmed and began to make soft cooing sounds. "Well, what do you know?" said Jake, delighted. Jean was 10 years old the last time anyone had handed her a baby. Her brand new baby brother Michael, all peach fuzz and milky breath. She remembered his chubby fist closing tightly around her finger, as Nell's now did. "See how he loves you already," her mother had said. Jean cuddled Nell as Jake and Katie continued their work while they chatted, mugs of tea going cold on the side. She found she still had a talent for making babies smile and laugh by pulling faces and babbling nonsense, though she gently moved her head away as Nell made a grab for her nose, her ears, and the hair that Jean had noticed Katie noticing. "I bet it won't be long now," smiled Katie, as though offering a gift to compensate. "Before your Ollie makes you a grandma." "Oh," said Jean, "wouldn't that be something?" She could see herself in the park, watched over by the passengers on the trains as she proudly pushed a pram towards the swings. "If you like," ventured Jean after a while, "I could take Nell for a walk around the park while you two get on with your work, give you a break for a bit." For the longest moment, Jake and Katie looked at each other before responding, silently gauging how the other felt about this suggestion. Then Katie finally turned to Jean. "Oh, would you?" she said. "You're an angel, Jacqueline. We'll have to get you round more often." "I could come tomorrow," thought Jean. And the day after that. Suddenly Jake grabbed his phone. "I've got to tell Ollie," he said, starting to text. "You'll never guess who our new babysitter is." Jean leapt to her feet and handed Nell back to Katie in one swift movement. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," she said. "I completely forgot. I can't. There's somewhere I need to be. In fact, I'm late already." She raced to the door, grabbing her coat on the way out and babbling apologies at Jake and Katie's bewildered faces. "I'm sorry," she said, almost bumping into the skip on her way off the drive. "I haven't been well. I'm not well. I'm so sorry." Hurrying back through the park, Jean noticed the frost had begun to melt, had been melting all along, and had turned to dirty wet slush beneath her feet. A train rushed by, heading home this time. Jean turned her face away. Michael would certainly be awake by now. She thought of the workmen at the grassy mound, with half a mind to lie down in one of those ditches they were digging and stay there forever. But it was quiet now at the mound, and the workmen were all gone. As Jean rounded the corner from Woodland Road, she saw that something had been built on top, but it wasn't until she got very close that she could work out what it was. It wasn't a bandstand. She realised now it was foolish to think that would ever be restored. What she saw instead was a ring of tall, sturdy standing stones, megalithic looking, quite magical. An ancient stone circle. Who would know, she thought, that the stones had only been placed there that day? Anyone would think they'd been there forever, that they were real. Jean climbed the mound and stood among them.
Jean, Darlene, Jacqueline. Written and recorded by Marie Crook. With music by Oscilloscope, and the series editor was Richard V. Hurst. You Are Here is produced by Levenshulme Old Library. It was commissioned by The Space and made possible with support from Arts Council England.